Coming up, U.S. Representative Melanie Stansbury is calling on the Biden administration to include tribal leaders more when it comes to tackling climate change. We're taking a deeper look at the cases before the U.S. Supreme Court on race-conscious admissions in colleges and universities, plus a politics update with Cook Macarro. I am Aaliyah Chavez. Join us for those interviews, plus headlines from the ICT newscast.
This program is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.
The Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Arizona State University is honored to be a supporter of Indian Country Today. Working with award-winning professors, Cronkite students learn news reporting, social media, shooting and editing videos, and producing content for communications industries. Cronkite's 15 professional programs give students the opportunity to cover critical issues throughout the U.S. and beyond. Learn more at cronkite.asu.edu.
This is the ICT Newscast with Aaliyah Chavez.
Amarawa Hopa, thank you for joining us. We start on the Navajo Nation, where 393 new cases and 4 deaths related to COVID-19 have been reported in a one-week period. The nation's Department of Health reports that the cases and recent deaths all happened between November 24th and December 1st of this year. That comes as cities, states, and other tribes are reporting a spike in COVID-19, RSV, and flu cases. The overall total number of positive COVID-19 cases within the Navajo Nation is now over 79,000. Navajo Nation President Jonathan Nez says he will continue to encourage citizens to get COVID-19 vaccines and booster shots. The U.S. Agriculture Department started food sovereignty programs over a year ago. Now the agency has recently launched its first deliverables. That includes cooking videos and recipes created by Indigenous chefs and seed-saving initiatives. ICT's Polly Dinetclaw has more on a new manual to help Indigenous ranchers make the move from cattle to buffalo.
A lot of cattle ranchers already have all the ingredients, right? They've got the expertise already.
Going back as far as the 1800s, the United States government attacked indigenous food supplies. From the Scorched Earth campaign on the Navajo Nation, where livestock was killed and cornfields burned to the ground, to the slaughter of the buffalo that once reigned over the plains and Southwest. This disruption continued through the Commodity Foods Program in the 1970s.
Some of it was done as a control mechanism to try and require Indigenous folks to comply with federal government policies that they might not otherwise do so. If you don't have access to food, it's awful hard to fight back. And so we've really been thoughtful about this history, this heavy history that the United States as a whole really carries with us, and to try and rethink about how we interact with Indigenous foods and Indigenous people, and rethink our food programs now from that perspective of restoration.
The USDA's new initiatives are hoping to reconcile this history. The government agency is working with the Intertribal Buffalo Council to help restore populations of buffalo to the land in order to preserve Indigenous foodways. Before colonization, many Indigenous nations relied on buffalo as a key source of food.
One of the things that I announced today was how we're going to transition from traditional cattle production to bison production. That's hugely important. We want to give the resources to the cattle producers who are interested in transition to bison production, the resources and support that they need.
The 50-page manual that was just released is the first step in this initiative. The document is meant to help ranchers think through the transition from cattle to buffalo. That includes everything from fencing and marketing to the birth cycle of buffalo. Should ranchers decide to make the transition, officials from the USDA are hoping to provide technical support when it comes to applying for grants. In Washington, D.C., Polly Dinetclaw, ICT News.
In Peru, climate change continues to strike as a lagoon central to Indigenous communities has completely dried up. The body of water, located over 13,000 feet above sea level, has been a source of food, fun, and beauty for the Aymara people. As the drought strikes the Andes, Native people there are in shock as a water once thought endless is now gone.
I am sad. The lagoon has never dried up before. This year we even cried because of the lack of water.
The rainy season in this part of South America should have started in September, and with requests for assistance from authorities going unanswered, many attended the Lord of the Snowstar Festival to dance and pray for water.
We came from Carapampa and other communities. We are all the same. No rain. Zero.
This is the area's driest period in almost half a century and is affecting more than 3,000 communities in the central and southern Andes of Peru. Now to South Dakota, where the state has hired an Indigenous woman to help with the missing and murdered Indigenous Peoples crisis. Last week, the state's Attorney General's office named Oglala citizen Allison Morissette as its first MMIP coordinator. Oglala citizen and State Representative Puri Poyer spearheaded efforts to create the position 2 years ago, but funding kept the job vacant. Current data shows 57% of the people listed in the state's missing persons database are Native American. However, Indigenous people only make up less than 9% of the total population. Morissette said in a statement she felt a lot of her relatives were overlooked, and her new job is to ensure, quote, that is not true. And those are the headlines for the ICT Newscast. U.S. Representative Melanie Stansbury of New Mexico won re-election to the House of Representatives. She succeeded Deb Haaland's seat in Congress. Stansbury is a member of the Subcommittee for Indigenous Peoples in the House Natural Resources Committee. This year, before COP27 in Egypt, she wrote a letter to President Joe Biden calling for the federal government to consult with tribal nations when it comes to tackling the issue of climate change. ICT senior correspondent Patty Tholahongva spoke to her about this and other climate change issues she plans to work on in her next term in office.
In her letter to President Biden, she laid out 5 goals she hoped he would adopt. Representative Stansbury, thank you so much for joining us today. How did the president respond to your request?
Well, thank you so much for having me on today, Patty. It's a joy to be here. You know, part of the reason why we sent this letter is that we felt really strongly and had received feedback from a number of tribal communities in the lead up to COP that there needed to be a meaningful consultation process with the U.S. government, as well as spaces created at the International Forum for tribal nations to come to the table to share their vision, their goals, their needs for climate justice and climate action. And so really the purpose of this letter was to ask the administration to engage in those consultations both in advance of and at COP itself. And, you know, we actually worked very closely with the administration. We worked with the State Department, and we were pleased to see that Secretary Kerry did convene a consultation with tribal nations in advance of COP, as well as there was spaces created at COP itself where the president himself, as well as Secretary Kerry, met with tribal nations, as well as other forums in which those conversations were held. But we need more of those. And, you know, this week, the president has just wrapped up his first in-person tribal nations conference since the Obama administration. There were several exciting announcements made about climate supports and climate action to be done in partnership with tribal nations, but there's a lot more work to be done.
You brought up the White House Tribal Nations Summit. So on November 30th, he actually released a presidential memo, and it standardized how federal agencies consult with tribes. How is this different than from past presidents, such as Barack Obama and his efforts to beef up tribal consultation?
Well, I think it's important to think about each administration builds on the successes and, in some cases, the failures of past administrations. the modern way of doing tribal consultation really came about initially during the Clinton administration. There was an executive order, and that was really the first time that any president had standardized consultation with tribal nations. The Obama administration built on that. They created the Tribal Nations Summit as a way to bring tribal leaders from all 570 plus federally recognized and state recognized tribes to Washington, D.C. to meet with the president and cabinet. And this order builds on the successes of the Obama administration and helps to standardize it further. I actually worked in the Obama administration from 2010 roughly until 2015 and worked on tribal issues at the Office of Management and Budget, and was there during a difficult time as we were transitioning to do improved budget consultation with tribes.
You talk a lot about that tribal knowledge, how tribes understand their homelands and so are the best people to go to when it comes to managing it in terms of climate change. Give me an example of a tribe that you think is really helping in that area.
Absolutely. Well, our tribes and tribal nations and communities have lived on lands across this continent since time immemorial, across every ecosystem, every region, and have been resilient through many, many thousands of years of change. And so our tribes are in some ways the most well prepared to bring their knowledge of these landscapes, of how to live resiliently in these landscapes. In New Mexico, we have 23 federally recognized tribes. We have 19 pueblos. Many of our pueblos have climate resilience programs. They're doing sustainable forestry and restoring not only places that are important for ecological and climate resilience, but also cultural resources that are in those spaces.
Before we go, tell us about the legislation you helped introduce to protect Chaco Canyon.
Well, I'm really glad that you asked about that. Chaco Canyon is a sacred and ancestral home to the Pueblo people, as well as the Diné Navajo people of the Four Corners region of New Mexico and Arizona. Chaco Canyon is in New Mexico itself, but there's a greater Chaco area, and it includes thousands of sites. It was the center of a very ancient trade route, a religious center for Pueblo nations, and people came from the northwest, south, and east and used those spaces for spiritual and economic and other needs. And it is very much a living landscape, even to this day. It is a sacred landscape. And while the major ruins at Chaco Canyon are preserved under federal law, a lot of the outlying structures and spaces are not. And so one of the priorities, especially of Pueblo and Indigenous leadership in the region, has been to protect the greater Chaco area from oil and gas development, because there's a lot of checkerboard authorities of both federal, tribal allotment, and private land in that area. And it happens to also be an oil and gas rich area. And so the legislation that myself and Senators Lujan and Heinrich and Congresswoman Ledger Fernandez was developed over years of consultation and leadership by Pueblo and tribal leaders and Navajo leaders, and consultation with those communities about that landscape. So it would create a 10-mile buffer zone around the current Chaco Canyon protected area to ensure that those lands are protected for their sacred and cultural and ecological importance for generations to come.
All right. Well, Representative Stansbury, thank you so much for joining us today and talking about climate change and the issues that not just Indigenous people face, but clearly our world faces.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
There are two cases before the Supreme Court that are looking at affirmative action in U.S. universities. Some legal experts are predicting that given the makeup of the conservative court, affirmative action could be thrown out. Joining us to shed a light on this is Dan Lewerenz. He's an assistant law professor at the University of North Dakota. Hi there, Dan.
Good to be with you, Aaliyah.
So give us a quick refresher of what affirmative action is and how it was started.
So affirmative action is technically any plan that helps to bring a certain type of applicant or entrant into an organization. Things like benefits for legacies for people whose parents or grandparents went to school. Technically, that's a form of affirmative action. But what most people think when they hear affirmative action are race-based preferences, and that's what's on display at the court right now.
Let's actually jump right into that. Tell us who the stakeholders are in these cases and what their arguments are.
Well, the cases were brought by an organization called Students for Fair Admissions, which is not an organization of students. It was founded by wealthy conservative activists for the sole purpose of challenging affirmative action decisions. They filed a lawsuit, one against the University of North Carolina, a public institution, and one against Harvard University, a private institution, alleging that their policies discriminated against Asian American applicants. They were careful not to characterize their lawsuit as being on behalf of white applicants. And the universities, of course, are on the other side, as well as organizations made up of the alumni of those institutions.
And Dan, I'm really curious, now that all of these cases, all of these really monumental cases are before the Supreme Court, it leaves so many of us wondering how they could decide. So in your prediction, what do you think it looks like?
It's always hard to predict exactly what the Supreme Court will do, but most people who heard the arguments in these cases, I think, are worried about the future of affirmative action. It seems like there is a majority on the court that is willing to eliminate race from consideration, which of course would not be an end to affirmative action. There would still be affirmative action to support legacy admissions. There would still be affirmative action to support athletics and other special missions within a university. It would just mean that the university can't make race a particular factor.
And what could that mean for Native students who are applying to college?
There's a couple ways to answer that, and it's really hard to know. So on one end, we have examples of states that have eliminated race from admissions consideration. California did that a number of years ago, Michigan did, and we typically see a reduction in not just Native applicants, but all racial minority applicants and admissions after that. Part of that is because the universities seem a little less friendly to those communities, and so they get fewer applicants. But a bigger part of it is that that the universities are just admitting fewer people of color generally, and that includes Native people. But the question gets complicated when we talk about Indians because of their status as a legal and a political group, in addition to their status as a racial group. And we saw that on display in the Brackeen case, which was argued just a few days after the college admissions cases. And you had justices asking about the relationship between the two cases, whether asking in Brackeen whether the federal government might be able to create a preference for Native applicants in college admissions. And frankly, maybe they could because of the political status of American Indians, and because many states have recognized that directly as well. They might be able to find a way to continue to protect Native applicants in a way that members of other racial groups might not be considered.
I mean, that leads me to a great point for Native educators or people who work in Native organizations who are maybe thinking about a decision that could come. Is that something that you think that they should prepare for? What advice would you have for them?
Within these educational institutions, they might want to think about the way that they consider Native applications. The political status that American Indians enjoy is based on a sort of a two-part connection, the political relationship between the federal government and the tribe, and then the political relationship between the tribe and their members. Now, that's not to say that only members of federally recognized tribes enjoy that political status, but that's kind of the heart of the political relationship, is membership in a federally recognized tribe. Many colleges and universities see their native admissions as much broader, as including students who aren't tribal members, as including state recognized tribes, sometimes even going so far as to just make it self-identification. And that might be more at risk if the Supreme Court gets rid of racial preferences for affirmative action. Educational institutions might need to reconceptualize whatever native programs they have as being more focused on the political status of Indians and those political relationships between the federal government, the state government, and tribes and their members.
Well, Dan Lewerenz on the affirmative action cases before the U.S. Supreme Court. Thank you as always.
Thank you.
More than half of the leaders of the 574 federally recognized tribes were in Washington, D.C. for the White House Tribal Nations Summit last week. It was show and tell for the Biden administration as cabinet members touted the $45 billion investments in Native communities. Joining us to talk about that and more is Cook Macarro. She's a partner with Spirit Rock Consulting and an ICT regular contributor. Hello to you, Holly.
Hi, Leah. It's good to see you.
So I want to just jump right in here. If you had to choose a single big takeaway from the White House Tribal Nations Summit, what would it be?
Once again, that it was held in person. I think there was a lot of value that it was held in person. Obviously, recognizing the dangers that the pandemic forced them to, have it virtually, but it just didn't bring the same sort of relationship building and opportunity to have those side conversations that are so important at these gatherings. And there are obviously a number of important policies that were put forth as well. But I really think the fact that it was back in person was the key part of it this year.
Actually, we had a few reporters there, and they actually spoke to some tribal leaders who expressed some frustration at the format of the summit because they felt that there weren't enough opportunities to address individual tribes and their concerns. Maybe comment on that.
I wasn't surprised to see that. Per usual, several of the days, the schedule was running a bit behind. And it just didn't facilitate those opportunities. And that really is, I think, at the expense of the administration to not be able to hear those voices from Indian country. And while it is certainly not a format to, advocate and, for individual concerns, but hearing the voices about the concerns from the tribes, from, the different regions, there were over 300 tribal leaders there, just extraordinary participation. So I wasn't surprised. It's a common complaint both at the Tribal Nations Summit, NCAI, that tribal leaders' voices need to be heard. And I really think our orgs and the administration, in spite of all of our efforts, we really do have to come to a place where that space for the voices of tribal leaders is as important as the rest of the agenda.
Holly, I want to move to Georgia because Raphael Warnock won his U.S. Senate election last night. Tell us what this means for Native communities and Indian country.
It might be hard to see what a Senate race in Georgia means for Indian country, right? What are the impacts to us? There are no federally recognized tribes. There are certainly very politically engaged and active tribes all up and down the East Coast, as represented by the United South and Eastern tribes. So those senators tend to be engaged on tribal issues no matter what. But for the rest of the country and what those impacts might mean, it is going to affect the makeup of committees in the U.S. Senate. The last 2 years with the 50-50 split has meant there's an equal number of Republicans and Democrats on committees. There will now be a one or maybe two senator majority on those committees. That'll make a difference to and hinder tie votes or other procedural hurdles that go along with the split membership. It also means they won't have to cater quite so much to Senator Manchin of West Virginia and Senator Sinema of Arizona, who, as we've all seen in the headlines over the past year, their priorities and interests have really driven the agenda, because without those votes, many Democratic priorities weren't able to be passed. And maybe the impact on the federal bench. Right now, I spent the last couple of days on the Hill and in the Senate in particular, and they are moving those judges right along, the federal judge nominations. That's the resulting makeup of the bench and the impacts on tribal law and that result from these nominations. That is where Indian country is going to see it. Maybe not as quickly, but the new one-seat majority is going to make a difference in how much they have to cater to Manchin and Sinema. Maybe allow them to put more progressive nominees forth and really begin to move their agenda without all of those concerns that those two members have brought to the table.
Well, Holly Cook Macarro, thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, Aaliyah.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. For all the latest, visit ictnews.org. From all of us in the newsroom, stay safe, my relatives.
Sometimes you got to take a stand, just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run.
The Sand Creek Massacre, the betrayal that changed Cheyenne and Arapaho people forever, focuses on tribal accounts of Colorado's deadliest day. Exhibition details at historycoloradocenter.org.
This program is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.